In the quiet suburbs just outside of Seattle, nestled between rows of identical townhomes and manicured gardens, lived a woman named Grace Lynn. Every morning at exactly 6:15, neighbors could count on seeing her step outside in lavender leggings and a soft white yoga top, hands pressed together in a prayer pose before beginning her daily stretch routine on the back patio. To those who knew her, or thought they did, Grace was the picture of peace. She smiled easily. She brought organic lemon bars to the neighborhood potlucks. She ran a popular yoga studio downtown and posted motivational quotes on her Instagram every morning, often accompanied by photos of her garden, her rescue cat, or the incense-lit corner of her minimalist living room. Even when her husband, Daniel Lynn, was reported missing 2 months earlier, Grace remained calm. She lit incense. She prayed. She told everyone he had left for a spiritual retreat in the mountains, a digital detox, she called it. It's something Daniel always wanted to do, she told her students with a soft, distant look in her eyes. And no one questioned her. Why would they? But things weren't as serene as they seemed. Neighbors in Building 8 started complaining of a strange smell. Something rotten, faint at first, then stronger by the day. It came from somewhere near apartment 408. At first, they thought it was a dead animal in the vents. A maintenance worker was called, but found nothing. The building manager even scheduled a pest control sweep. Still, the smell remained. Meanwhile, Grace kept her routine. At dawn, she bowed toward the rising sun and whispered mantras of peace. She placed fresh white lilies on the small altar in her living room. An altar, she said, was for Daniel, until he find his way back. She smiled, always smiled, until one day, the police knocked on her door. What they found inside would make national headlines and haunt the city for months. Grace and Daniel Lynn had once seemed like the perfect couple, at least on paper. She was elegant and calm, the kind of woman who brewed herbal tea from scratch and journaled each morning in flowing cursive. He was sharp and ambitious, a rising star in finance with a knack for numbers and a freshly pressed shirt every day. They met 8 years earlier at a wellness retreat in Oregon, where Grace had been teaching yoga and Daniel was dragged along by a friend trying to quit Wall Street. The connection was instant. By the third day, they were sharing green juice and long conversations about the future. By month 4, they were living together in a condo with floor-to-ceiling windows. And by year 2, they were married in a small private ceremony with only 11 guests, barefoot on a beach in Santa Cruz. At first, life with Daniel felt like living in a poem. He brought her flowers every Friday, not the generic supermarket kind, but bundles of wild lavender and fresh sage from Pike Place Market. They spent rainy Sundays making sourdough from scratch and sipping herbal infusions while reading Rumi aloud to each other. They called each other by Sanskrit nicknames. He was Arjun, she was Devi, and wore matching bracelets they'd picked up from a spiritual boutique in Portland. Grace documented their life in soft-filtered photos. Hiking trips in the Cascades, silent meditation weekends, matcha dates on cloudy afternoons. To the world, they were a vision of modern balance, the power couple who combined mindfulness with ambition. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the edges began to fray. It started with Daniel's job. After a promotion at the hedge fund, he became increasingly unavailable. Late dinners, weekend calls, short temper. Grace would set the table with ceramic plates and herbal candles, only for Daniel to come home exhausted, barely touching the food. His compliments turned into corrections. His silence stretched longer than the yoga breaths she practiced. And then the control crept in. It wasn't overt, not at first. A raised eyebrow when she wore a dress that showed too much collarbone. A disapproving comment when she suggested collaborating with a male colleague for a wellness podcast. "You don't need to put yourself out there like that," he said one night, closing her laptop with a soft but final touch. "You're already enough. Just stay here." There were no shouting matches, no slaps or bruises, just a steady erosion of space, of self. Grace began to shrink inside her own life. She stopped teaching Sunday workshops. She turned down an offer to open a second studio. She deleted old photos from her Instagram that featured male clients or beach trips with girlfriends. When friends asked if everything was okay, she responded with that signature gray smile and a carefully crafted sentence: "We're just finding a new rhythm." The truth was, Daniel had reset the metronome, and Grace was expected to dance to it. One evening, she overheard Daniel on the phone, a conversation that turned hushed the moment she stepped into the hallway. He said it was work. She didn't ask again. But that night, while folding laundry, she found a receipt in his jacket pocket from a luxury spa in Napa Valley. 2 guests, 1 suite. She stood there for a long time, just staring at the slip of paper, her hands motionless over the half-folded T-shirt. She didn't confront him. She didn't scream. She just placed the receipt into her journal, closed it carefully, and lit incense. It was what she had always done. Breathe, detach, recenter. But the seed had been planted, and every time he laughed at her devotionals or rolled his eyes at her need for ritual, it grew. Every time he criticized the softness in her voice or the slowness in her pace, it grew. Every time he acted like she was some delicate inconvenience, ornamental and obsolete, it grew. What she never said aloud, not even to herself, was that part of her had begun to fear him. Not in the way one fears physical harm, but in the way a bird fears a closing cage, silent, invisible, and inescapable. And so, she performed peace like it was a routine, a breath, a mask, until one day that mask cracked. But as with many perfect pictures, the cracks didn't show until much later. Daniel had a dark streak. Not violent, not at first, but sharp. He was demanding, critical. What started as teasing turned into control. He didn't like Grace wearing certain colors. He complained when dinner was 5 minutes late. He scrutinized every dollar she spent, even though his salary covered more than enough. Grace, always the peacemaker, didn't push back. Instead, she made excuses for him. "He's under a lot of pressure. He's just tired. He loves me. He just shows it differently." Behind closed doors, Grace began to shrink. She taught fewer classes. She deleted her personal Facebook. Friends she once called weekly noticed the silence, but when they asked, she simply said, "I'm focusing on my inner peace." Daniel, meanwhile, grew colder. Rumors surfaced that he was having an affair with a coworker. Grace never confronted him. Instead, she buried herself in routines. Yoga at dawn, homemade meals, carefully arranged incense by the window. She curated the image of serenity because that's what she had always known how to do. Keep things beautiful, no matter how broken they were inside. But what neighbors couldn't see from the outside was how deeply the isolation had set in. At night, Grace slept in a separate room. She journaled not about healing, but survival. In one entry, later discovered by investigators, she wrote, "He looks at me like I'm a burden. I feel like wallpaper in this house, pretty but invisible. One day he's going to leave me, or worse." And perhaps that fear, or something deeper, began to plant the seed of what would come next. It was a Tuesday morning when Daniel Lynn vanished. Grace told the police that she had last seen him on March 3rd, standing by the door with a canvas backpack slung over one shoulder, wearing his old hiking boots and holding a book on meditation. According to her, he kissed her cheek, said something vague about needing space, and walked out into the early morning fog. He didn't say where he was going. He didn't say when he'd be back. She assumed it was another one of his solo retreats, a silent escape to a cabin or some secluded Airbnb with no cell reception, something he'd mentioned doing before but had never followed through on. When Daniel didn't come home that night, Grace said she wasn't surprised. When he didn't call the next day, she told herself he was off the grid. When a week passed and his phone continued going straight to voicemail, Grace calmly informed his workplace that he was on personal leave. At first, no one was concerned. Daniel had a reputation at work for being unpredictable. He'd once taken a week off to reassess his purpose. His coworkers said he seemed burned out, maybe even depressed. His boss gave it a few days, then a few more. Grace assured everyone that Daniel had done this before. He just needed time. Still, something felt off. Grace didn't seem worried. In fact, she carried on exactly as before. She posted yoga videos with captions like "Breathe through what you can't control" and "Let go of attachment, even to people." On her Instagram stories, she showed clips of her lighting incense, folding laundry, and sipping tea under fairy lights. Everything looked picture perfect. Too perfect. Friends noticed that she never once asked for help finding him. She didn't hand out flyers. She didn't call hospitals. She didn't beg people to keep an eye out. When his sister, Monica Lynn, called in a panic, Grace responded with a calm voice. "Daniel's doing what he needs to do. He'll come back when he's ready." But Monica wasn't the only one raising quiet alarms. A woman named Riley Tompkins, once Grace's closest friend and former co-founder of the original yoga studio, had reached out to the police days before Grace officially filed the missing person report. She had seen the Instagram stories, the serenity, the curated captions, and it all felt wrong. "I know how she smiles when she's truly at peace," Riley told detectives. That wasn't peace. That was performance. They hadn't spoken in nearly a year, not since Daniel insisted Grace distance herself from draining people. The last time they met was over tea in Green Lake. Grace had seemed thinner, quieter. She kept glancing at the door. Her answers were rehearsed, almost as if she were being watched. When Riley brought up a yoga retreat they'd once dreamed of running together in Sedona, Grace blinked slowly and said, "That was a different life." Then she changed the subject. A week later, Grace unfollowed her on all platforms. Riley never got a response to her texts after that, but she hadn't stopped worrying. So when Daniel vanished, Riley dug up the one email she never deleted, a message Grace had sent nearly 10 months earlier at 2:43 a.m. with a subject line, "Does love make you disappear?" The message had no body text, just the subject. That was it. Riley had stared at it for days back then, unsure what to do. She even drafted a reply, then deleted it. But now, with Daniel missing and Grace behaving like a woman reading a script, the email haunted her. She printed it and brought it to the police. At first, the detective brushed it off as cryptic, maybe poetic, but when Riley shared more, the estrangement, the way Daniel slowly cut off Grace's community, the changes in her behavior, they began to take note. "Grace was the strongest person I knew," Riley said. "But strength becomes silence when you're punished for using your voice." She didn't claim Grace had done anything. She didn't speculate. She only said, "Please, just look deeper." Later, when her testimony was used in court, Riley sat in the back row and wept silently as Grace took the stand. No longer the friend she remembered, but a hollowed-out version, wearing an orange jumpsuit and a face that looked like it hadn't known rest in years. They never spoke again, but Riley never changed her phone number, just in case. Monica wasn't convinced. "This isn't like him," she later told detectives. "He would never disappear without telling me, especially not now, not with the things he had going on." What things? No one knew for sure, but Monica hinted that Daniel had recently found out something troubling about Grace. A financial discrepancy, maybe an affair. She wasn't certain, but she said Daniel had called her just 2 days before he vanished, sounding angry and agitated. Then he was gone. 2 weeks passed, then 3, then 4. Grace filed a missing person report with the local police. Finally, but she did so in a tone so casual that the officer on duty later described it as oddly rehearsed. She never cried, never raised her voice, just filled out the form, folded her hands in her lap, and said, "I trust he's where he needs to be." And still, she went on, lighting candles on a small altar in their living room, arranging flowers beside Daniel's framed photo, bowing deeply each morning before her yoga live streams. Viewers often commented how centered and at peace she seemed. But peace was not what lay beneath the surface. Not behind that calm smile. Not behind that closet door. And definitely not behind the sealed wooden cabinet in the bedroom. The one that no one had touched in weeks. It started with a smell. By early May, nearly 2 months after Daniel Lynn's disappearance, residents of the complex at Oak Ridge Heights began noticing a strange odor in the hallway of the 4th floor. At first, people blamed it on the trash chute, then a dead rodent. But it got worse, stronger, thicker, a sour, decaying stench that clung to clothes and hair. It was coming from apartment 408, Grace's unit. Linda McCall, who lived next door, had always liked Grace. They'd exchanged garden tips and shared tea on the balcony once. But lately, Linda had grown uneasy. She hadn't seen Grace take out the trash in weeks. The blinds were always drawn. She heard strange noises at night, dragging sounds like something being moved across the floor. So, Linda called building management. They in turn called the police. At first, the officers who responded expected to find a dead animal, maybe a burst pipe. But when they knocked on Grace's door, she answered with the same serene smile as always. "Officers," she said softly, "how can I help you?" They explained the complaints. Grace nodded, invited them in, and led them through the clean, minimalist condo. A faint aroma of lavender and incense filled the air, nearly masking something far more putrid beneath it. "Do you mind if we check around?" one officer asked. "Of course not," she replied. "Make yourselves at home." The living room was immaculate. Cushions perfectly arranged, a soft meditation track playing from a speaker. A framed photo of Grace and Daniel sat beside a burning candle and a small bowl of white lotus petals. "An altar to his journey," she said. The kitchen was spotless. No dishes in the sink. No signs of life. But when they reached the bedroom, things changed. One wall held a custom-built wooden wardrobe. Not unusual in itself, but one of the officers noticed something strange. The wood panels didn't match. One section looked newer, recently sanded. Another had screws that didn't quite line up with the rest. "Has this cabinet been remodeled?" the officer asked. Grace hesitated for a moment. Just a flicker. Then, "Oh yes. Daniel was working on a project before he left. He loved carpentry. Said it helped him center his mind." She chuckled softly. "He never finished it." The officer nodded, but noted her answer. "And the smell? Stronger in this room. Much stronger." They left that day without incident, but the report they filed raised red flags. The inconsistencies, the behavior, and that cabinet. 3 days later, a search warrant was approved. When officers returned, they brought forensic experts and a cadaver dog. Grace stood silently by the window as they moved through the home. She didn't ask questions. She didn't protest. The dog began to bark the moment it entered the bedroom. They pried open the false panel at the back of the wooden cabinet, and what they found would shake even the most hardened detectives. Wrapped in layers of plastic and thick with the unmistakable stench of death was the body of Daniel Lynn. His face was barely recognizable. His limbs twisted unnaturally. There were clear signs of trauma to the skull, blunt force, likely fatal. Time of death, approximately 7 to 8 weeks prior. The silence in the room was deafening. Grace, still standing by the window, turned to the officers and said quietly, "I knew you'd find him eventually." What Grace didn't say, what she never said, was what had happened in those first 72 hours after Daniel died. The moment his body hit the floor, time shattered. She stood frozen, eyes wide, breath shallow, the yoga mat she had just rolled up still under her arm. Blood was already pooling. A hairline crack on his temple widened slowly, like a red vine snaking across porcelain. Her first thought wasn't a run. It wasn't even a call for help. It was silence. Utter, perfect silence. She backed away, sat down on the floor, legs folded underneath her like she was beginning a class. Her hands trembled as she lit a stick of incense, sandalwood, his least favorite, and placed it in the ceramic bowl near the window. The smell of iron and wood smoke mingled in the air. For nearly 20 minutes, she didn't move. She watched the candle flame flicker and tried to regulate her breath. Inhale. Hold. Exhale. Don't fall apart. It wasn't until a neighbor slammed a door 2 units over that she snapped back. She fetched a blanket and covered his body. Not out of shame, not yet, but because the sight was unbearable. It felt surreal, like he might sit up at any moment and tell her this was just another one of his cruel tests. A final lesson in submission. She barely slept that night. She lay on the couch, eyes wide open, the silence in the condo broken only by the creaks of settling wood and the distant hum of someone else's television. Her heart beat like it was counting down something inevitable. By morning, the calm arrived. Not peace, never peace, but a chilling sense of detachment, like a switch had been flipped deep inside her. She made tea. She watered the orchids. She even answered a student question on Instagram about hip alignment. Then she pulled on gloves and opened her laptop. Search history would later reveal her queries. What happens to a body after 24 hours indoors? Can decomposition smell travel through walls? Is it illegal not to report an accidental death? She ordered plywood from a local supplier under a fake name, drove to a 24-hour hardware store and bought caulking material, plastic sheeting, and gloves. The cashier asked if she was remodeling. "I'm sealing a room," she said, with a gentle smile. "Spiritual work." You know, that same day she cleaned. Methodically, bleached the tiles twice, laid down layers of plastic. She moved Daniel's body to the bedroom and propped it against the wall for hours while she reconfigured the wardrobe, sawing through the lower panel, fastening a false back, sealing every corner with odor-blocking caulk. She took breaks to meditate, to eat, to update her followers. When the final screw went in, her knuckles were bleeding, but her breath was steady. She placed lilies at the altar, folded Daniel's last worn shirt, and set it beside a candle. Then she looked around the apartment. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. They placed her in handcuffs. Outside, as she was escorted to the police cruiser, neighbors looked on in stunned silence. One of her students from yoga class burst into tears. "She taught us to breathe through suffering," the woman sobbed. How could she do this? Grace didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply bowed her head, as if in meditation, and stepped into the back of the car. What began as a missing person case was now something far more disturbing. A brutal murder hidden behind a mask of peace and a yoga mat. The news broke within hours. Yoga instructor found living with husband's corpse hidden in bedroom cabinet. The headline spread like wildfire across Seattle and beyond. By that evening, the story had already made it to national broadcasts. Cable anchors delivered the shocking details with furrowed brows and dramatic pauses, the kind reserved for the darkest twists. Grace Lynn, the peaceful, poised yoga teacher with a 5-star rating on Yelp and 30,000 Instagram followers, was now a murder suspect. A mugshot replaced her glowing profile photos. Her hands were cuffed, her hair tied back in a bun, and her face disturbingly calm. The public couldn't believe it. Her students were devastated. She was my anchor, one woman told reporters, standing outside Grace's now-closed yoga studio. She helped me through my divorce, taught me how to forgive. And now this. Another student added, it's hard to reconcile the woman who whispered affirmations into our ears with a person who kept a dead body hidden in her home for 2 months. But the evidence was overwhelming. During a search of Grace's apartment, police found receipts for building materials purchased 6 weeks before Daniel's alleged spiritual retreat. Plywood, plastic wrap, odor-sealing caulk, screws. Investigators also discovered a journal in Grace's handwriting, and what they read sent chills down their spines. One entry, dated 2 weeks before Daniel vanished, read, sometimes I wonder if he'll ever stop hurting me. But maybe he doesn't have to. Maybe I just need to remove the source of the suffering. There were darker entries, ones that spoke of planning, patience, acceptance, words that blurred the line between trauma and intent, a blend of spiritual detachment and cold calculation. Police also retrieved deleted text messages from Grace's phone. Some were to a friend in California, hinting that Daniel had become dangerous. But others seemed carefully worded, as if laying the groundwork for a defense before anything had happened. Despite the growing mountain of circumstantial and digital evidence, Grace refused to admit to premeditation. In her first formal interview with detectives, she sat across the table, hands folded, voice level. It wasn't murder, she said. It was release. A moment I couldn't stop. But it brought silence, stillness, peace. She described the night it happened in fragments. An argument, a shove, Daniel falling. Blood pooling fast. Panic. Then calm. I didn't want to believe me, she whispered. But I couldn't let him stay. When asked why she didn't call 911, her reply was haunting. Because I knew no one would believe me. They never do when the bruises aren't visible. But her lack of remorse, her months of calculated behavior, her teaching yoga above his hidden body, that the public couldn't understand, nor forgive. On social media, the backlash was swift and merciless. Hashtags like hashtag Namaste Killer and hashtag Yoga of Death trended for days. Her Instagram account became a battlefield between former fans and furious strangers. She taught me to breathe through pain, one follower wrote. She breathed through murder, another responded. Reporters swarmed the Oak Ridge Heights condo complex. Neighbors gave emotional interviews. Students cried on camera. Daniel's sister, Monica Lynn, spoke briefly to the press, holding up a framed photo of her brother. He wasn't perfect, she said, tears streaking her cheeks. But he didn't deserve to be thrown away like garbage. No one does. The world now waited, not for Grace's next yoga class, but for the trial that promised to reveal the truth behind the calm. The courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the front rows. Former students, neighbors, even strangers who had never met Grace Lynn waited in silence, eyes glued to the woman they had once called Seattle's Angel of Serenity. But this time, Grace wasn't wearing lavender leggings or flowing linen. She wore an orange jumpsuit. Her hair was pulled tightly back, her expression unreadable. The prosecution called it cold-blooded murder. They laid out a timeline built on data and intent. Emails, receipts, surveillance footage, a slow, deliberate choreography of planning. They showed how weeks before Daniel's death, Grace had ordered plastic tarps, odor-blocking materials, heavy-duty gloves, and cleaning agents. How she had searched phrases like, how long does it take for a body to decompose indoors? And can you get away with killing an abusive spouse? But it wasn't just the search history and receipts that gripped the courtroom. The prosecution called Mr. Jeff Hanley, a 52-year-old clerk at a local hardware store who testified that Grace had come in alone late one evening. Hoodie up, sunglasses on despite the hour, and asked for materials to seal out moisture and odor in a wooden cabinet. He remembered her because she paid in cash and thanked him in a whisper. She seemed blank, he said, glancing toward the defense table. Not nervous, not panicked, just like someone already somewhere else. They also showed security footage from the day Grace picked up plywood at a supply depot under the name Rachel D., a fake alias. She smiled at the employee, signed the receipt, and loaded the planks herself. But the most stunning testimony came from a forensic audio technician who revealed they had enhanced the voice memo found on Daniel's phone. Beyond the shouting and crashing, they isolated a faint but unmistakable third sound, the voice of Grace whispering a Sanskrit mantra moments after the struggle. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti, she said, the chant for peace. While Daniel was dying, the prosecutor declared she was chanting for stillness. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Then came the defense's witnesses, and the tone shifted. Grace's former therapist, Dr. Lena Patel, took the stand with visible hesitation but resolute clarity. She confirmed seeing Grace intermittently over a 5-year period. Her notes, entered as evidence, chronicled a slow psychological descent, panic attacks, dissociation, feelings of erasure. She wasn't angry, Dr. Patel said. She was afraid. Afraid of what would happen if she left, and afraid of what would happen if she stayed. Another key witness was Ms. Riley Tompkins, Grace's estranged friend and former business partner. Riley had flown in from California to testify, and her presence brought an eerie silence over the room. She described the last time she saw Grace, jumpy, withdrawn, unrecognizable, and shared the cryptic email Grace had sent her late at night, months before Daniel disappeared. Subject line, "Does love make you disappear?" Riley read aloud, voice cracking. That wasn't a question. It was a warning. But what truly stunned the courtroom was the audio. Her defense attorney, however, painted a very different picture, one of years of manipulation, emotional torture, and quiet despair. They called her a survivor, a woman who had endured years of psychological abuse, threats, financial control, and emotional neglect at the hands of a man who wore a polished smile in public but broke her in private. To bolster their case, they brought in Grace's former therapist, who testified that she had treated Grace off and on for years. She lived in a state of hypervigilance, the therapist said. Her self-worth was shattered. She spoke of feeling trapped, like Daniel had built a cage around her that no one else could see. The jury listened, torn between horror and pity. But the most powerful moment came when Grace herself took the stand. She stood slowly. Her voice was soft, steady. She didn't plead. She didn't apologize, at least not in the way people expected. I didn't wake up one day and decide to kill my husband, she said. I woke up every day trying to survive him. She described years of Daniel monitoring her emails, mocking her students, threatening to expose her for alleged fraud if she ever left him. She recounted moments when he'd sit in silence for hours, refusing to speak to her, only to suddenly explode in rage over something trivial, an overcooked meal, a mismatched sock. It wasn't the kind of abuse you can photograph, she said, but it was real, and it hollowed me out. She admitted to covering up his death. She admitted to building the cabinet. She admitted to lying to his family, her students, the world. But when the prosecutor asked why she didn't call the police, her voice cracked for the first time. Because I knew they wouldn't believe me. Not someone like me, the calm one, the quiet one, the one who teaches people to breathe. People like Daniel don't get arrested. They get promoted. In closing arguments, the prosecution insisted that this wasn't self-defense. it was premeditation. Grace could have left. She could have asked for help. Instead, she planned, executed, and concealed. She didn't just kill Daniel. She lived above his corpse for 8 weeks while teaching yoga classes and watering her plants. That's not trauma, the prosecutor thundered. That's calculation. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On the third morning, the verdict came in guilty of second-degree murder. Not premeditated enough for first degree, they said, but not accidental, not justifiable. Grace Lynn was sentenced to 32 years in prison without the possibility of parole for 20 years. She didn't cry. She simply bowed her head and whispered something inaudible, perhaps a mantra, perhaps a prayer. The verdict was barely out when the media frenzy reignited, louder, harsher, and more divisive than ever. Grace Lynn sentenced to 32 years in shocking husband murder case. Yoga instructor who hid body in closet gets decades behind bars. Namaste no more. The dark fall of Seattle's peace grew. The headlines range from cold and clinical to brutally sensational. Talk shows dissected every minute of the trial. Podcasts popped up overnight with titles like Stillness and Blood and The Cabinet of Grace. True crime YouTubers scrambled to upload their takes, reusing the same courtroom sketch and surveillance stills in countless thumbnails. But this time, the reaction wasn't one-sided. Some people saw Grace as a monster, a woman who faked serenity while living above her husband's corpse, who fooled her community and weaponized peace. She's a sociopath in yoga pants, one TV pundit declared, a wolf in warrior pose. Others, however, saw something else. They saw a woman push beyond her breaking point, a victim of years of silent psychological warfare, invisible wounds no X-ray could scan. They pointed to the statistics. How many women stay in abusive relationships because they're emotionally trapped, financially strangled, or too ashamed to speak out? Social media reflected the split. One viral tweet read, "She should have left." And the top reply, "Do you say that to a bird with no wings?" In the weeks that followed, a national conversation emerged, not just about domestic abuse, but about how society defines victims and villains. Was Grace a calculated killer, or a woman society failed long before the murder? Advocacy groups weighed in. Some condemned the verdict as too light. Others said it was too harsh. Meanwhile, the people closest to the case struggled to move on. Daniel's sister Monica tried to maintain her composure in front of reporters, but her grief ran deep. She launched a memorial scholarship in her brother's name, calling it the Daniel Lynn Foundation for Mental Resilience. He wasn't perfect, she said at the launch event, but he didn't deserve to be erased. On the other side, a quiet group of Grace's former students began writing letters, not to the media, but to her. Some expressed betrayal, others heartbreak. One letter simply read, "You taught me how to stand still in the storm. I just wish you'd found your own shelter." Grace, now inmate number 48192, began teaching yoga again, this time inside the Women's Correctional Facility in Eastern Washington. A prison volunteer described her class as strangely healing, even for those who knew her story. "She doesn't talk much," the volunteer said. "She just says, 'Breathe.' We start with breath, and then it's quiet." The world had moved on, as always does, but Grace's story lingered like a bruise beneath the surface. A woman once praised for her poise had become a parable, a question mark, a mirror. Was she a villain wearing the mask of peace, or a survivor who was never taught how to scream? 2 years passed. The trial had ended. The headlines faded. The podcast moved on to newer tragedies, fresher scandals. But inside the gray walls of the Clearwater Women's Correctional Facility, Grace Lynn began living a second life, one not shaped by curated images or candlelit serenity, but by quiet repetition, whispered apologies, and a long, hard work of facing herself. Each morning, before the sun rose, Grace rolled out a worn yoga mat in the corner of cell block D. She taught a small group of inmates, women serving time for theft, assault, drugs, even murder. There were no mirrors, no incense, no matching outfits, just breath. "Close your eyes," she would say, her voice low and calm. "Breathe in through your nose, out through your mouth. You're not your past. You're not what they called you. You are here, now, and that's enough." Some of the women hated her at first. Others were drawn to her without knowing why. One inmate, a mother of 3 serving 18 years for armed robbery, said, "She don't cry, but she feels. You can tell. It's like she's holding the weight of something she can't let go." Grace never spoke of Daniel. Not during class. Not to the press. Not even in her court-mandated therapy sessions. But sometimes, late at night, when the others were asleep, she would write in a small journal, the same way she used to when the world thought she was whole. One entry read, "I miss the smell of lemon balm and morning light through the curtains. I miss my cat. I miss the lie I used to believe, that peace could be curated like a bookshelf or a photo filter. But mostly, I miss the version of myself that still believed I was worth saving before it was too late." Back in Seattle, the condo on Oak Ridge Heights sat empty for nearly a year. No one wanted to rent it. Eventually, it was sold at a loss to a couple from Oregon, unaware of its past until neighbors awkwardly warned them. The wooden cabinet was torn out, the floor replaced, but the air never quite felt the same. Daniel's family visited his grave quietly. No memorial stones, just a simple plaque in the ground. Daniel Lynn, 1984 to 2023. May you finally find the peace you sought. Monica stopped talking to reporters. In her last interview, she said, "I don't think I'll ever understand what really happened in that apartment. And maybe that's the cruelest part, that he died in silence, and she lived with it for 2 months like nothing happened. But I've stopped trying to make sense of it. Now I just try to forgive what I can and carry what I can't." A week after the trial ended, Grace received a letter. There was no return address. The handwriting was shaky, printed in all caps, and the envelope was postmarked from Arizona. The prison guard slid it through the cell door without comment, just as she did with junk mail and court updates. But Grace noticed immediately this one felt heavier. Inside was a single piece of lined paper. No greeting, no name, just 27 words written in thick black ink. "I watched your trial. I lived with a man like that for 11 years. I survived barely. You weren't wrong. You were just too alone." Grace read it twice. Then again, she folded the letter neatly and placed it between the pages of her journal, the same one where she had once written about incense and betrayal, silence and survival. She didn't cry. She hadn't in months. But for the first time since the verdict, she felt something unnameable. Not closure, but recognition. Somewhere out there, someone understood. And that, she realized, was the first mercy she'd been offered in a very long time. And what about Grace? She'll be eligible for parole in 28 years. By then, she'll be in her 60s, a woman marked by scandal, infamy, and a story that divided a nation. But in that prison, within those cold concrete walls, she still teaches yoga, still starts every class the same way. Close your eyes, breathe in, let go. Because for Grace Lynn, stillness was never the absence of chaos. It was surviving it. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next gripping case. We share true crime stories every single day. Real people, real consequences, and the hidden truths that shock the nation. Thanks for watching, and stay safe out there.